welcome everyone. I am Michael Haley Goldman. I am the Executive Director of New Hampshire Humanities. So pleased you're willing to join us tonight on a Friday as the week is ending. We're all tired and potentially grumpy just because it's been a long week. But we're really, really pleased to have Dr. Melinda Negrón-Gonzales joining us tonight from University of New Hampshire. We are going to be looking at U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century, particularly on the topic of violent extremism in the Middle East. So throughout the 21st century, U.S. foreign policy is heavily focused on counterterrorism, particularly in the Middle East following 9/11 attacks. Recent headlines are talking about Hamas over ISIS, but counterterrorism is going to remain a persistent theme in U.S. foreign policy discussions. Over time, U.S. strategy has shifted from large-scale military intervention to lighter military footprint, foreign aid, and reliance on local partners. During this presentation, we're going to examine the tools and policy used by the U.S. to address extremism in the Middle East, emphasizing the interplay between counterterrorism and safeguarding of human rights. By examining contemporary conflicts such as Syria's civil war and the Israeli-Hamas conflict, we're going to be able to explore the complexities and ethical considerations that shape the U.S. approach to violent extremism. Evaluating successes and failures, we can consider what strategies the U.S. should pursue moving forward. So looking forward to this as a program. Before we begin, as always, we want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. First of all, funding. We would not be here tonight without funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and donations from NHH supporters like many of you on the call tonight. Thank you all for being supportive of New Hampshire Humanities, and thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this possible. New Hampshire Humanities supports more than 1,000 programs last year, and that served about 30,000+ people in 181 communities all around New Hampshire. Most importantly, we partner with about 400+ organizations. That means that wherever you are in New Hampshire, I can't help you if you're not in New Hampshire on this, but wherever you are in New Hampshire, we were probably in a community near you for the programs that we were supporting all over the state. If you would like to support our work or learn more about what we're doing, I encourage you to visit our website, nhhumanities.org. You can find information about future talks. You can find out about programs near you, and you can sign up for our e-news to learn about what's coming up. The e-news goes out once a month, and people use it as a calendar of things happening near them or around the state that they might want to join in on. The other thing I want to make sure we talk about is the Zoom webinar that we're on. I know we've all been doing Zoom for a long time, but just to cover the basics, there's a couple of details we want to make sure you know about. You can use the chat button that communicates directly with staff. So if you're having a technical difficulty, let us know and we'll try to help as best we can. If you want to ask questions from our speaker, what we'd like you to use is the Q&A box that's there at the bottom of your screen, and put questions there. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. And we are sorry, we know we don't always have time to get to all of the questions. Finally, we do want you to add your comments and participate in tonight's program, and think about maintaining community as you do it. Please make sure that whatever you type into the chat in the Q&A follows general guidelines of civil discourse, is encouraging a productive communication and being respectful. So thank you for doing that. So we'll go ahead and start the program. Hopefully we've gotten those other few people that I was expecting to come in. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Negrón-Gonzales, who teaches courses on global affairs and development and conflict studies at the University of New Hampshire. She is the founding director of the Global Conflict and Human Security Master's Program at the UNH Carsey School of Public Policy. Welcome back to Dr. Negrón-Gonzales.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be back. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you for tuning in on a Friday at 5 p.m. And thank you, Michael, for the invitation to speak. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, okay? I have a PowerPoint slideshow that I want to share with all of you. So give me a moment here. Okay, go. There we go. Okay, we're ready here. U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century, countering violent extremism in the Middle East. So As you know, the 9/11 attacks in 2001 fundamentally reshaped U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, leading to a focus on counterterrorism and military interventions aimed at eliminating the perceived threats to the U.S. Today, of course, Washington is very focused on China and Russia and strategic competition with great powers and numerous presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden have all talked about pivoting away from the Middle East and toward the Asia Pacific region. But things keep developing in the Middle East that bring the US focus back to the Middle East. And so US attention in the Middle East has been focused toward various jihadist groups, Al Qaeda and ISIS linked organizations. But also in the past year, we've seen Iranian proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah also wreaking havoc in the region. And so I'll talk about all of those things today. This is the agenda that I'm going to follow, and I'm going to try to give a really broad overview. I don't assume that people have a lot of deep prior knowledge, so this is going to be a rather general overview, and then we can get into more specifics during the Q&A. So I'm going to start by talking about U.S. national security in the Middle East more broadly before I start talking about U.S. counter-extremism policy. I'm going to define some of the terms that we use, and then I'm going to focus on three cases: Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And at the end, I'll talk about the challenges and criticisms of U.S. counterterrorism or countering violent extremism policy, and try to bring out my crystal ball and talk about what we expect to see in the coming year and beyond. Okay, so very broadly, what are U.S. national security interests in the Middle East? The U.S. is, of course, concerned with access to energy resources, but not necessarily for the U.S. The U.S. does not get most of its energy resources from Middle Eastern countries. Nevertheless, the U.S. has an interest in allied countries and U.S. businesses abroad having access to energy resources. And of course, it's important for global commerce. And so that second point there, maintaining regional stability, is a primary U.S. interest in the region, in large part because of the energy resources that are in the region. The U.S., of course, has a continued interest in countering terrorist groups that endanger Americans and also allied states. That's the next thing there. The U.S. is interested in enhancing the security of allies in the region. And then finally, the U.S. is interested in preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction in this region. An arms race in the Middle East for nukes in particular would be bad for everyone, everywhere. So let me talk about some of the terminology that we use in academic studies, and let's start with terrorism. It is a highly politicized term. And in my classes and my work, I tend to use this definition here, which is a general definition that you see quite a bit in academic studies. Terrorism is defined as politically or ideologically motivated violence carried out by non-state actors that targets civilians or non-combatants. There is an ongoing debate about who or what is a civilian or a non-combatant, and I won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but you can ask me about it in the Q&A. But generally speaking, in academic studies and in my courses, we stick with this very narrow definition of terrorism as being carried out by non-state, ideologically driven actors targeting civilians. It's really important to note that the groups that we're going to talk about today and many of the groups in the world that use terrorism as a tactic use terrorism as one tactic of many. And so a lot of what's called terrorism colloquially in the news and so on is actually insurgency. And insurgency is distinct from terrorism in its methods and its targets. So, as a general rule of thumb, terrorism is used specifically to describe violence against non-military personnel, whereas insurgents target military personnel and engage in guerrilla warfare or what's called irregular warfare. So think Taliban in Afghanistan targeting NATO forces. Those acts were considered acts of war rather than acts of terrorism, whereas when the Taliban bombed, let's say, a market or a mosque, that was considered a terrorist attack. Okay, and then finally, there's one more term that I'll use, and that's violent extremism. And violent extremism is the term of choice at multilateral organizations like the United Nations. And violent extremism is just a sort of generic term that includes groups that use terrorism, either terrorism exclusively or terrorism and guerrilla warfare and insurgency. So violent extremism is sort of a catch-all term that includes terrorists and insurgents. Okay, so back to the Middle East. So let's talk briefly about some of the major groups in the Middle East. And oops, here's another term that I also use that is very common in academic circles as well as government agencies, non-state armed groups. It is a generic term for any kind of non-state group that carries out politically motivated violence. And so here we've got a list of some of the major groups in the Middle East that are active. All of the groups listed here have thousands of fighters engaged in terrorist attacks, but also irregular warfare. And all of the actors here are also leading broader political movements that engage in nonviolent political activities. Most of the groups here on this slide have governed a territory or are currently governing a territory today. And so we've got the first three, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Islamic State, and HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. All three of those are jihadist. And we'll talk a little bit more about what jihadists are. Then you've got the Syrian Democratic Forces and the PKK. Those are actually groups that are ideologically motivated by Marxism and far left ideologies. And then finally, at the bottom there, we've got the Houthi movement, Hamas and Hezbollah. All three are part of the so-called axis of resistance, and all three are supported by Iran and have narrower interests than some of the jihadist groups up here, these three groups here. So you're probably wondering why there are so many non-state armed groups in the Middle East today. First and foremost, there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and that's putting it mildly, with the dysfunctional governments that are corrupt and oppressive in the region. The region is filled with dictatorships and authoritarian regimes that do not meet the basic needs, oftentimes, of their citizens. So one of the reasons stems from just the dissatisfaction of various groups, especially marginalized groups in these Middle Eastern states. Secondly, we see a lot of rebellion in a lot of these Middle Eastern states because of the transnationalism that's at the root of jihadist ideology. So jihadism is a modern phenomenon, and jihadist ideology calls for the creation of a theocratic Islamic empire that will cover Muslim majority societies, Muslim majority countries. And so there is a transnationalism at the root of that ideology and at the root of Al-Qaeda's and the Islamic State's strategy in the world. And that's why you see so many different Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates throughout Asia, throughout the Middle East, and throughout Africa as well. So the third reason you see so many non-state armed groups in the Middle East has to do with the proxy war phenomenon that we've been seeing. Um, Throughout history, great powers have often competed by supporting proxy forces, right? This is not unique to the Middle East. And so basically, it's really hard to understand the proliferation of non-state armed groups in the Middle East today without also looking at state strategies in the Middle East, because a lot of them work through militia proxies in neighboring countries. And so proxy war is something that we hadn't seen necessarily in the past in this region, but that we are seeing all across the Middle East in the 21st century. And the groups in gray on this slide, Syrian Democratic Forces, Houthi, Hamas, Hezbollah, are all militia proxies of a particular state. The Syrian Democratic Forces are the proxy partner of the United States in Syria, and the three gray, these three here, let me get my cursor, Houthi, Hamas, Hezbollah, are all proxies of Iran. We'll talk more about that. And so if we zoom out for a moment and look past the Middle East, we see that this proxy phenomenon is not unique to the Middle East. And we know from various research that has been done that nearly half of all rebel groups after World War II are believed to have received support from at least one state, typically in the form of military assistance. And so today, when we look out even beyond the Middle East, we see that these civil conflicts are very, very, very internationalized. Few modern civil conflicts are truly domestic today. Foreign powers are often deeply engaged in the civil wars that we see and often provide significant resources to either the state belligerent or to the rebels. And we see that a lot in the Middle East. And we know there's a lot of great research that's been done that third-party intervention actually prolongs these wars. So we're seeing longer wars because of this proxy phenomenon. Okay, so let's go back to the Middle East then. So what are the tools in the toolkit that the US uses when it comes to its counter-terrorism or counter-violent extremism policy in this region? So the tools in the toolkit are, of course, armed force, foreign aid, and diplomacy. So let's start with armed force. As you can see on this handy map, for at least 15 years. And you'll notice that they're especially concentrated around the Persian Gulf area. And that goes back to the first Persian Gulf War, if you can remember back that far. Then in orange, we see other sites with military presence. The blue triangles show you US naval deployments, approximate location, right? And then you see these beige colored countries. Those are the countries or territories where major Iran-backed militias are active. And we're going to talk about Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, as well as the Palestinian territories, and Lebanon less so. Okay. Foreign aid, of course, is a tool in America's toolkit to prevent and counter violent extremism abroad, and particularly for these conflict-affected countries where it's not just sporadic terrorist violence, but they are experiencing full-blown civil war or a major insurgency. The US provides what it calls stabilization assistance. Okay, and so a lot of these countries have been experiencing civil conflict for a while, and they may experience a lull in fighting, or the group may go deep underground, and there's an opportunity for foreign aid and for that country to go ahead and engage in things like rebuilding the school system and the health system and reconstructing the area. And so that's what stabilization, assistance goes for in these countries. And the thinking is that these types of activities here that you see here will prevent the resurgence of extremist groups by addressing the economic and social issues that often breed extremism, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. And so this handy pie chart comes from a USAID report. USAID is the United States government agency that is tasked with spearheading foreign aid projects and distributing funds to various people around the world. And this gives you an idea of what the US is funding, what types of projects the US is funding. Okay, let's take a trip to Iraq. So we start with Iraq because the US has been heavily involved in Iraqi politics in the 21st century, as you know. So a little bit of background, as you know, the US invaded and occupied Iraq back in 2003. And the primary objective was to topple Saddam Hussein's regime, citing the threat of weapons of mass destruction and also alleged links to Al-Qaeda. Both of those things turned out to be very wrong. No WMDs, no links between the Iraqi government and Al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, the US was there, occupied the country, and insurgencies, plural, raged to resist the occupation by the US. This is where we see fertile ground for Al-Qaeda to create its group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq basically exploited the instability and the violence during that first year of American occupation to build itself, recruit, and so the Al-Qaeda in Iraq insurgency is a problem, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not created until after the American occupation. So from 2004 until 2011, which is when US forces left Iraq, the US forces in the country worked to dismantle Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq renamed itself to the Islamic State of Iraq. Yes, that Islamic State. So the US, the Bush administration specifically, had arranged for US troops to leave Iraq in 2011, and US troops left Iraq in 2011. The thinking was that even though Al-Qaeda in Iraq, renamed Islamic State of Iraq, was still around and was still a problem, and everyone knew this, the Iraqi forces had been trained by the United States and could handle the counterterrorism against the Islamic State. And we saw by 2013 that was certainly not the case. Sunnis in Iraq, disaffected Sunnis, were recruited by the thousands to join the reconstituted Islamic State of Iraq, and foreign fighters traveled also to join the Islamic State of Iraq. And by 2014, Islamic State of Iraq had captured an alarming amount of territory in Iraq. And that is what this handy map shows here, okay? This is an old map. It's showing you in this sort of mauve color how much territory ISIS controlled in January 2015. Okay, and so you see all of this area, and the capture of Mosul really took the world by surprise because Mosul is Iraq's second largest city. So long story short, the US troops are back in Iraq by invitation of the Iraqi government, and you have the Obama administration launch Operation Inherent Resolve, which continues today, and it covers Iraq and Syria. By around 2017, much of this territory had been taken from ISIS, and still have about 2,500 US troops in Iraq today. They are supposed to be withdrawn by 2026. We'll see. And of course, the US has provided humanitarian and stabilization assistance to the Iraqis. It's important to note before I move on to Syria that since the Israel-Gaza war started last year, the US forces in Iraq now also face attacks by Iran-backed militias in Iraq. There are many of them. They were actually instrumental in fighting ISIS, but they are backed by Iran, and so they have been attacking US installments there and US troops in Iraq. So that's a new development. That's a spillover of the war in Gaza. Let's move to Syria. So, as you know, in Syria, civil war erupted in 2011 as people protested for democracy as part of the Arab Spring, right? So the US leaves Iraq in 2011. That same year, you have the Arab Spring. So lots going on in the region. And the Islamic State was able to exploit the civil war in Syria to also capture a lot of territory. If you go back to here, you can see all of the territory that Islamic State was able to capture in Syria. Yikes. So Operation Inherent Resolve, as I mentioned, was launched by the Obama administration back in 2014. And this global coalition of dozens of states and other partners to defeat ISIS, right? The global coalition was led by the US. And in Syria specifically, the US worked alongside the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a local militia, Kurdish led. So this handy map over here shows you what it looks like today, right? So the Syrian government, meaning the Assad government, has recaptured a lot of the territory. You see that in gray. You see that there's this little blue area over here. US-led coalition forces are there to protect oil resources. And up here you have the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and American troops protecting this area. And Turkey and its Turkey-backed groups are here. And here in this northwest corner, you still have Al-Qaeda-linked HTS that controls some territory there. Whoops, excuse me. So again, the US provides humanitarian and stabilization assistance, and today we have about 900 troops left in Syria. And there are concerns that when Trump becomes president again next year, he will do what he wanted to do in 2018 and 2019. So there is this concern that if the US leaves Iraq or Syria, ISIS will regroup once again and start recapturing territory that it lost. And then finally, we're going to take a trip to Yemen here. So Yemen is another country in the region that has experienced a horrific civil war in the last decade. Civil war erupted in 2014, 2015. Before that, the US had been carrying out drone strikes against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for years. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is actually one of the most active and dangerous branches of Al-Qaeda. And so AQAP has conducted numerous attacks both within Yemen and also internationally, including, if you think back to around 2009, the underwear bomb plot on a US airliner. And so the US has been very focused on AQAP in Yemen for years. And the primary tool in the past has been drone strikes against AQAP. And of course, this is part of the proxy dynamic that I talked about earlier, because not only is AQAP active in Yemen, The US is also very concerned about the Houthi rebels in Yemen who do control a big swath of territory there in the West. And you can see this handy map, which comes from Al Jazeera, excuse me. It's a bit old, but I use it here to show you how this is all contested territory in Yemen, as is the case in these other countries experiencing civil war. And so you've got Houthi control over here, government control, Southern Transitional Council control, and so forth. It's a bit of a mess. And so the US has been supporting a Saudi-led coalition to deal with the civil war aspect of this. And then in the last year, there's been a new development, sort of spillover from the Gaza conflict, because the Houthi movement is aligned with Iran. And as such, it is anti-Israel, and it has been carrying out attacks here in the Red Sea area to stop shipments going to Israel, but also to disrupt global shipping. And so because of this, there is now a coalition that was launched in December of last year by the US called Operation Prosperity Guardian. It's a coalition of 24 countries with a mandate to protect international shipping. And then the following month, there was another operation that was launched by the US, Poseidon Archer, separate coalition willing to conduct offensive operations to degrade Houthi military installments here in Western Yemen. And so that's ongoing, and that's a spillover of the Gaza war. In the meantime, for a while, there have been some efforts, diplomatic efforts, to get the warring parties in Yemen to actually come to some kind of a political settlement, which is usually how these civil wars are ended, and that is ongoing. So let's talk a little bit more about US support to allies. Oops, excuse me. US support to allies includes all of the following, right? Military aid, weapons sales, intelligence sharing, logistical support, diplomacy, training programs, sanctions against Iran, because we haven't talked about Israel and Gaza yet, and we need to, right? So the support that goes to US allies like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, is meant to counter the extremist groups that those two allied countries are dealing with. And because they are dealing with non-state armed groups that are backed by Iran, there's also this counter-Iran dynamic happening here with respect to US support and US counter-terrorism policy and strategy in the region. And so that's why I added sanctions against Iran here. What the US has been doing has been implementing these very harsh sanctions against Iran, hoping that it will recalculate and not provide as much support and perhaps change its own proxy strategy. Of course, the sanctions did not stop Hamas from carrying out the heinous attack on October 7th last year. And then because Israel has been carrying out this also heinous operation in Gaza that a lot of the people in the region and in the world are looking closely at, the Iran-backed groups in neighboring Lebanon, specifically Hezbollah, and in Yemen, specifically the Houthis, have also been carrying out attacks against Israel. And then for the Houthis, as we saw here on this map, let's go back here, are carrying out attacks on commercial shipping vessels here. And so the US has been providing these allies, such as Israel and Saudi Arabia, with all of these different types of support. So let's talk about some of the key challenges and criticisms of US counter-violent extremism efforts in the region. The US has successfully driven back ISIS in the last several years. And so its policy has been successful on numerous fronts, but there are still key challenges and criticisms of U.S. counterterrorism or CVE efforts in the region, and so I'll talk a little bit about these. The alleged atrocity crimes and human rights violations by U.S. supported actors is highly problematic for the U.S. The U.S. support to dictators perpetuates bad governance, which is a key driver of extremism, right? I mean, the US partners in the region and allies in the region, for example, the Gulf states, Iraq, and so on, are authoritarian governments of all stripes, right? I mean, the Saudis are Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. Iraqi politics is democratic to a certain degree, but it's a bit of a mess. And so Iraq may not be a full dictatorship, but it is certainly a very fragile democratizing state that has a lot of authoritarian elements in it. And so as the US continues to support these various regimes in the region, it's a bit counterproductive because those authoritarian regimes routinely violate human rights of their own citizens, and they are known for bad governance. In essence, not meeting the needs of people, basic needs, and also governing in a way that is very exclusivist. And this is a real big problem in places like Iraq, where Shia dominated groups and parties dominate the government and exclude the Sunnis. And that's a key driver of extremism in Iraq. And so US support to some of these governments, it can be a bit counterproductive, right? It perpetuates the bad governance that we think is a key driver of extremism. External support to allied states and proxies prolongs insurgency and civil war. There's actually a lot of research that's been done on this recently, looking at third-party interventions and proxy war. And we know that external support to allied states and proxies prolongs insurgency and civil war in general, right? This is not specific to the US, but in general. And so US support to these allies is actually prolonging insurgency and civil war in some cases. And it also makes these insurgencies and civil wars even more deadly than they otherwise would be. That's what the research tells us. And then people have criticized the US for not focusing enough on resolving the conflicts, because a lot of these countries are experiencing terrorist attacks and insurgency because of these broader political conflicts that really need to be resolved. And critics argue that the US hasn't done enough to actually resolve the conflicts. There is this very narrow focus on counterterrorism, countering these violent groups, doing kill and capture type operations, but not enough to actually use diplomacy and other tools to try and resolve some of these conflicts so that we see less non-state violence and less state violence. And then finally, there are arguments that the US support to some of these groups actually risks the escalation of a regional war. And we're seeing that today, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm sure you all will have some questions. In the interest of time, let's move on. And so let me take out my crystal ball and talk about US CVE efforts in the Middle East in the short term. Military aid, of course, will continue. There will be a continuation of US drone strikes and covert action in various places. The US will continue this light footprint approach, right? It's called light footprint because the US does not want to send a lot of US troops on the ground as combat forces against these groups. Will probably be a decrease in troops under the Trump administration because, Trump has said numerous times he wants US troops out. There will be a continuation of diplomacy as a significant tool in the toolkit, right, for the US. There's going to be an increase on US reliance on partners in the region, with authoritarian states, with the local forces. There will be, I think, a continuation of U.S. administrations sort of looking past the human rights violations of partner states and partner groups, based on the argument that the fight against the terrorist is very important, and sometimes allies make mistakes, but I don't think Trump and his administration will focus a lot on human rights violations in the region. And then finally, humanitarian and stabilization assistance will continue under the Trump administration. There are stabilization assistance, excuse me, is something that the US government provides, irrespective of whether or not there's a Republican or Democrat in the White House. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions and a great discussion on where the US should go.
There's so many places to start, but one of the things, taking the moderator's prerogative of kicking things off, you started off with a lot of defining, right? Like, how do we think about what is an insurgent versus a terrorist, violent extreme? Like, there was a lot of, okay, how do we define these terms? For the people who are not academics, why is that so important? Why do we need to make those distinctions? I did work with people who were in genocide prevention, and there was a lot of discussion about, is it a genocide or is it just a mass atrocity, which is also terrible? Why would that be an important difference? And the public was often really frustrated with those kinds of distinctions.
Yeah, thank you for that question. A great question. So we tend to conceptualize these things and stick with these definitions, in part because it makes it easier for us to study these phenomena and categorize groups so that we're not comparing apples and oranges. Because what a lot of academics and researchers and people at the State Department are interested in doing is trying to figure out how to end the violence. And so we look globally at various scenarios and try to look at these specific actors to see what kinds of activities they're engaging in. Are they mostly carrying out terrorist attacks against civilian? Is that their primary tactic? We put them in a category here, and we look at how they operate, and then we think about counterterrorism. What should counterterrorism look like for a group that is mostly using terrorist attacks against civilians? Versus, what does counterterrorism look like against an insurgent army that is carrying out irregular attacks? That's counterinsurgency. It looks a bit different. And so that's part of the reason why we use different terms for these groups. Understanding, of course, that a lot of these groups, including the ones that I talked about, use a range of tactics: terrorist attacks against civilians, irregular warfare. But if we don't categorize them properly, we might end up using the wrong tools for a particular organization, if that makes sense. And so that's part of the reason why we focus a lot on the concepts and defining them. And then, of course, legally speaking, there are legal definitions of terrorism. Each state has its own legal definition. There is no universal definition. And there is pushback from some people in some region on certain groups being called terrorists, right? Because they are resistance fighters or they are freedom fighters and so on. So that's another layer there for why it's important to define these terms.
All right, thank you. We've got some other great questions coming in. So Terry is asking, who administers humanitarian stabilization assistance? Where does that come from?
So it comes from a lot of different places. What the USAID, this government agency, will do is provide aid to local organizations or to international NGOs to distribute the humanitarian aid. And so there are a lot of these humanitarian organizations, Mercy Corps, that are on the ground in these conflict zones, and USAID will distribute funds to those organizations, also to UN agencies that then actually distribute the aid on the ground. There's something called localization that is talked about a lot in global humanitarian and development circles. And the administrator of USAID, Samantha Powers, has been working to get USAID to work more closely with local partners for a long time in the humanitarian space. International NGOs and foreign aid agencies have been in control of the projects and the programs in these conflict zones. And there's been a call by people around the world for locals to actually have a little bit more say and control on where aid goes and how. And so we're seeing that slowly happen, where a lot more local organizations are being brought into the fold. So for example, Syria, you may have heard of the White Helmets, which is a local humanitarian organization that is supported by the international community, including the U.S. Foreign Aid Agency.
So something you had said you were going to get back to. So I'm really glad we have a question from John, who's asking, what is the prospect of putting in place some controls or limits over Israel and Gaza?
This is the question that everyone is talking about. I don't know, but here's the lay of the land. As we all know, the Biden administration has been criticized for not doing enough to really push Israel to protect civilians and ensure the flow of humanitarian aid to people in Gaza. The Biden administration had issued a letter to the Netanyahu government that the U.S. expected a flow of humanitarian aid, and there was a threat of withholding some key support. This is hot off the press. The Israelis stated that they met those expectations that the Biden administration had set. Human rights organizations have argued otherwise. And so Human Rights Watch, for instance, has issued a report stating that the Israelis have actually not met the expectations of the Biden administration. Nevertheless, the Biden administration is not going to curtail shipments of arms and so on. So what will we see in the coming couple of months that Biden is still president? I'm not sure that we're going to see anything much different from what has been done in the past year. With respect to the Trump administration, I'm not sure. Trump did say that he expects the Israelis to wrap up the Gaza war soon, but he hasn't provided details about how he is going to try to bring an end to the war. So it's not clear that anything is going to change dramatically in the short term, but I am optimistic that in the next administration, things will be done to bring about the end of the war in Gaza. In the meantime, human rights organizations and other entities will continue to pressure the US, pressure the Israelis, and we'll just have to see what happens.
The limit of your crystal ball, I realize, is something that we all have to accept.
Yeah.
Um,
And I will say that, I mean, the US does have some influence over Israel, Saudi Arabia, other state allies, but there are also limitations to what the US could do. And there's actually some research that's been done on the withholding of arms, and whether or not that actually changes states' behavior. And the research does not suggest that states dramatically change their behavior because their patron has stopped shipments of arms. They find them elsewhere. And so it's not at all clear that even if the US scaled back or held back, that the Israeli state would necessarily dramatically change its policy.
so Quentin's thinking about the stance that some people take that we should completely remove U.S. funding and troops and support for areas of conflict like the Middle East, and wants to know what would be an argument against that, or do you think removing U.S. support would be a good move?
Oh, good heavens, no. I do not think removing US support would be a good idea. I mean, for the reasons that go back to that first slide that showed US national security interest in the region, we know that non-state armed violence is going to continue to be a huge problem in the region. And so if the US withdraws all of its troops and also support, the region is going to descend further into war in these various countries and is going to become even more volatile. And so volatility in a region that has so many of the energy resources that the world needs is a problem for global security in general, not just American security, not just the security of American allies. So there would be a huge power vacuum if the US pulled out completely and or stopped supporting these allies.
So it's an interesting question from Beverly, that like you mentioned drone warfare, that will continue, and drone warfare is remote control killing. So she makes the argument that in the past, when soldiers were killed, it was an incentive to reduce violence, and that does the reliance on drone warfare have an impact on the willingness to end conflicts? And I have to throw in there, as we're looking at more artificial intelligence use within control of systems, is that an impact as well? Just to throw that in.
Yes, absolutely. Drones, AI, this is a problem, and numerous people have criticized not just the US, but state governments in general that rely heavily on drones, and AI. And it does seem to desensitize and to prolong wars, and it is a problem, but I don't see that changing. If anything, what I hear when I hear state officials in general, not just American state officials, but state officials talking about these issues, is a desire to rely even more on drones because they are seen as low cost, especially in terms of human resources, right? I mean, and that's one of the reasons why they are such an attractive option to states. They are low cost in terms of human life. And so even though there are some very, very good moral arguments, legal arguments against using drones because there are legally, it's sort of a gray area. I don't foresee a dramatic shift. If anything, when I hear government officials across the region talk about wars and counterterrorism operations, I hear more emphasis on drones.
So we've got a question from Marina, and I'm going to try to condense it a little bit, but it's really looking at the fact that the Middle Eastern policy doesn't seem to be that concerned about human rights as a rule, right? And um, why is that? Is it because most of those countries, including our allies, commit violations regularly and you can't censor them as a result? Is one of the main differences in the way we deal with extremism, and is that one of the reasons that we deal with extremism in other countries differently than we deal with domestic terrorism? Is there a connection within that?
Can you say that last part one
Yep.
more time?
Is that one of the main differences, that being the fact that our allies are often committing human rights violations? Is that one of the reasons that we have a different stance with extremism in other countries versus domestic?
Yeah, and when we're talking about human rights violations and atrocity crimes in the region, yeah, I am talking about primarily these regimes in the region against their own citizens or against citizens in neighboring countries. Whereas in the US, the way that the US deals with domestic terrorism or violent extremism in the domestic space, civil liberties are a consideration, even if law enforcement officials don't always get it right. But we don't see that in a lot of the countries experiencing major terrorist attacks and insurgency. There is a tendency for governments to overreact even in sort of quasi democracies like Turkey. A lot of my research has focused on counterterrorism and human rights, specifically in Turkey, which has had sort of this hybrid democratic or authoritarian system for a while. And the Turkish state and armed forces have overreacted to terrorism for decades and have carried out numerous atrocities and human rights violations, and they are a close NATO ally of the United States, and the United States might pay some lip service to Turkey's human rights record, but does not withhold support generally. And you see that with the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. There was during the Biden administration a few years ago, he stopped a shipment of arms to Saudi Arabia. And sometimes you do see that, and you especially see that from the U.S. when a country is not one of the US's main allies, but when it comes to some of the US's partnerships with serious allies in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia and so on, and Israel, the US, whoever is in the White House, tends to turn a blind eye toward the human rights violations that are being carried out by those governments toward their respective citizens.
So, it's after 6 o'clock, and I don't know if we want to end on it's not the happiest topic.
It's not a happy topic, but I am optimistic that Elon Musk met with the ambassador, the Iranian ambassador in New York. I mean, that's hot off the press, and it's sort of this very bizarre thing. But I mention it because we've seen some really interesting developments in the Middle East over the past year. It is different from Trump's first term in that we have seen a softening. I don't even want to call it a full-blown détente, but we've seen a softening between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That proxy dynamic has been really destabilizing in the region for a long time. And so there have been flutters of hope here and there that some of these countries that have had these terrible relations are actually interested in normalizing relations, including Iran. And so I am hopeful that in the coming year, Trump, who claims that he's a deal maker, is actually going to show us that the US is going to play a significant diplomatic role in getting some of these parties to actually normalize relations. I don't know, we'll see, but I am optimistic. We have to be hopeful that there will be some stability and some normalization of ties.
So thank you. And thank you, Dr. Negrón-Gonzales, for talking to us through this tonight. A lot of really complicated things here. Thanks everybody for being here. I
Thank
do want to
you.
make sure I also put in a plug, and we're going to change speeds next month. So I hope you'll join us for Humanities at Home on December 6th. The program will be From Sewer to Superstars, The Untold Story of Kevin Eastman and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with Daniel Yezbik. This is relevant because this was something that was created in New Hampshire. If you didn't know that this is actually a cultural phenomenon that started here in New Hampshire. So we hope you will join for that. As always, thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting this, and to many of you and out there who continue to support the work that we do. We think this is an important part of the discussion happening here in New Hampshire, and we hope you will be a part of it. After the program, please fill out the survey. This is the way we know what people are thinking and what we want to do next. That's really important help to us, so please help us out in that way. And thank you all again. Thank you, Dr. Negrón-Gonzales. This has been fabulous having you back. We hope to figure out a different topic next time that we can bring you in for.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.